Picture this, 40 degrees below zero. A wind so sharp it feels like broken glass dragged across your skin. The Great Plains stretch in every direction, a white ocean under a sky the color of iron. There are no forests here, no mountains to break the wind, no walls of firewood stacked for the season. Just grass, ice, and silence. Now imagine surviving there. Not for a night, not for a week, for an entire winter, for 1,000 winters. And doing it without ever building the roaring bonfire you'd swear was the only way to stay alive. Because here's the secret nobody tells you. A giant fire on the plains wasn't survival. A giant fire was a death sentence. And the people who lived there knew it long before the first European ever set foot on that frozen ground. What if I told you their real weapon against the cold wasn't fire at all? It was something quieter, something older, something so intelligent that modern engineers are still, right now, in 2026, reverse engineering it and putting the same principles into passive houses and eco-architecture. What you are about to hear will change the way you think about survival, about intelligence, and maybe even about civilization itself. Stay with me until the end, because the deepest secret of all, the one that kept entire nations alive through winters that would freeze a modern city in a week, isn't a technology. It's a way of seeing the world, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's begin with the lie. The lie that Hollywood taught us. The lie of the huge, cinematic fire crackling in the middle of a tipi, casting warm orange light on smiling faces. It never happened. Not like that. A great fire on the open plains was, quite simply, madness. And the people of the plains were not mad. They were mathematicians of survival. And every stick of wood, every dried root, every scrap of fuel was counted like a banker counts gold coins. Think about what a big fire actually does. It roars. It devours. In a treeless landscape, a single evening of extravagance could cost you a week of warmth. And it does something worse. A large flame acts like a chimney in reverse. It pulls warm air violently upward and out through the smoke hole. And while it does, it sucks freezing air in from every gap along the ground. Your feet turn to stone. Your children shiver in a dwelling that looks bright, but grows colder by the minute. And there was another price. Smoke rises, smoke drifts. On a still winter morning, the column of a great fire is visible from 20 miles away. In a world where rival bands moved even in winter, where old blood feuds did not sleep for the snow, that smoke was an address written in the sky, a gift to any enemy who cared to read it. So the real fire, the true fire, was small, ridiculously small by our standards. A handful of coals, a flame no larger than a child's fist, just enough to warm the hands, just enough to melt a little snow into water, just enough to keep the dark at bay. And this is the first, and maybe the most beautiful, of their principles. They understood, in their bones, that heat is not made. Heat is kept. Producing warmth is easy. Refusing to let it leave, that is the art. The whole system, everything you're about to hear, is built on this one quiet idea. And it is the idea that a wasteful civilization forgot. Now, if the fire was small, what was doing the heavy lifting? What was actually keeping people alive when the wind screamed at 40 below? Look at a tipi. Really look at it. Most people see a picturesque cone of hides, a summer thing, a relic. What they are actually looking at is one of the most elegant pieces of climate engineering ever designed by human hands. Every angle is deliberate. The cone shape is not decoration. It is aerodynamics. When a plains wind hits a flat wall, the wall shakes and heat leaks. When that same wind meets the sloping curve of a tipi, it slides around it, like water around a stone in a river. The heat inside stays where it belongs, and the tipi is not a perfect cone. If you measure carefully, the rear wall is steeper than the front. The whole structure leans, ever so slightly, into the prevailing west wind, presenting a harder shoulder to the enemy and a gentler face to the sun. It is not a tent, it is a body, turned to meet the weather. Inside there was a second skin, a hidden liner called the ozan, hung from the poles at about head height and dropping down to the ground. Between this liner and the outer wall was a thin corridor of trapped air, just air, and nothing more. And yet that thin ribbon of air was doing exactly what a modern double-glazed window does today. It broke the cold. It stopped the icy outer skin from ever touching the warm inner one. The people who built this had no thermodynamics textbooks. They had winters. And winters, if you survive them long enough, teach you everything. Along the base, they packed skins, brush, or turf, sealing the teepee to the frozen earth. No draft could crawl in beneath the walls. At the top, the two triangular smoke flaps, the ears, could be pivoted with long outside poles. They were live valves, adjusted to the wind, always keeping the smoke moving, never letting it linger. Inside all of this sat that tiny hearth, and the warm air it made would rise, roll across the inner ceiling, drop between the ozan and the wall, and circle back, again and again. A gentle, invisible current of heat, endlessly recycled. A convection engine, running on a handful of coals. This is not a tent. This is a machine for staying alive. And it worked so well that families sat inside it in silk-thin clothing, while, outside, the temperature was cold enough to kill a horse. But even the finest machine is only a frame. To bring it to life, they needed a material of almost supernatural usefulness. And nature had already provided it. It weighed 2,000 pounds, and it walked on 4 legs. For the peoples of the plains, the bison was not an animal. It was a moving continent. It was walking architecture. It was food, shelter, light, and heat, arranged in a single beating body. The cover of the teepee was made from bison hides, stitched together with sinew, tanned with patience. The hair was not scraped away. It was trimmed short and left in place, because those countless fibers held countless tiny pockets of dead air. Insulation, the same principle as the down in a modern parka. Smoke from the daily hearth soaked slowly into the leather, waterproofing it, darkening it, hardening it against wet snow and cracking cold. Over a lifetime, that hide covering became a second skin for the family. Living leather, breathing armor. Now, here is what almost nobody knows. On the treeless plains, the primary fuel was not wood. It was dung, dried bison chips. Say the word if you like, and picture the fire it makes, because it is remarkable. A dry buffalo chip burns slow, steady, and almost without smoke. It gives off a clean, patient heat, perfect for that small indoor hearth. Women and children gathered these chips through the summer and autumn, walking miles across the grass, piling them in stacks like farmers stacking hay. This was not a chore. This was strategic reserve. This was fuel security. Without those chips, life on the plains would simply have been impossible. Then there was bison fat, melted and poured into stone bowls. With a floating wick of twisted moss, it became a lamp. A quiet, golden lamp that gave off just enough heat to matter in a well-sealed tipi. The same fat, eaten, warmed the body from the inside. Mixed with pounded dried meat and wild berries, it became pemmican, an ancient energy bar so nutrient-dense that Arctic explorers were still eating it into the 20th century. Even the bones were not wasted. Boiled for hours, they surrendered their marrow into a rich, warming broth that a shivering hunter could drink to bring himself back from the edge. One animal, everything. Shelter, fuel, light, food, clothing, blankets. This was not exploitation. This was a covenant, a relationship of 1,000 years, and it worked because both sides needed each other. Now, wearing all this warmth is another skill entirely. And here too, they had solved a problem the modern world only recently rediscovered. Every outdoor clothing brand in 2026 will tell you the same thing. Layer, layer, layer. Wick, insulate, shield. They didn't invent it. They rediscovered it. The first layer, against the skin, was soft tanned deer or elk hide, worn like a shirt, worn like leggings. Its job was to pull moisture off the body. Because on the plains, sweat is not comfort. Sweat is death waiting for nightfall. On top of that came a second skin, often turned fur inward, so that a still cushion of air was trapped between hairs. That is exactly, molecule for molecule, what a modern fleece does today. And over all of it, when the wind rose, came the great bison robe, a single winter hide, taken in the season when the fur was thickest, worn with the woolly side against the body. By day, it was a cloak. By night, it became a bed. One garment, two lives. Winter moccasins climbed high on the ankle. Inside them, dry grass or rabbit fur was packed as insole. That grass did two jobs at once. It insulated against the frozen ground, and it drank the sweat that would otherwise have frozen to your foot and cost you your toes. Every few days, the grass was pulled out and replaced. A simple ritual, a small act of survival. Mittens of beaver fur, hoods stitched into robes. Every garment cut loose, never tight, so that blood could keep moving and warm air could keep circulating. They understood something profound. The body itself is the furnace. Clothing is not there to make heat. Clothing is there to make sure the heat you already have never leaves. But raw hide is stiff and cracked and dead. To turn it into these living garments took a chemistry as old as fire itself. Turning a bison's hide into soft, waterproof clothing was the work of women, and it was work of extraordinary skill. First, the hide was pinned flat and scraped with tools of bone and stone. Fat, flesh, every last shred was removed. Muscle memory, generations deep, guided the hand. Then came the strange, brilliant secret, tanning with brains. The brain of the animal was mixed with water into a thin, pale paste and rubbed deeply into the fibers of the hide. The enzymes in that tissue broke the collagen bonds that made the skin stiff. It became supple. It stopped decaying. It became, in effect, alive again. And here is the poetry of it. Every animal, it is said, has just enough brain to tan its own hide. Nature's arithmetic, precise to the ounce. Then came the work. The hide was pulled, stretched, twisted, dragged across ropes and log edges, kneaded by hand, again and again, for hours, sometimes days. If you stopped, the fibers glued themselves back together as they dried, and everything you had done was lost. This was patience made physical. Finally, the finishing. The hide was sewn into a bag and hung over a slow, smoky fire of rotted wood. The smoke soaked in. It sealed the leather. It turned it a soft, golden brown. It repelled water. It kept insects away. The result was a material lighter than modern canvas, tougher than modern fleece, breathable, warm, and beautiful. Every family walked wrapped in a chemistry laboratory of 1,000 years. But not everyone lived in tipis. And if you go east, into the forests, you find something even more astonishing. In the great forests of the Northeast, the Iroquois built longhouses, not tents, fortresses, 60 meters long, sometimes more. Wooden frames sheathed in elm bark, the whole thing crouched against the winter like a sleeping animal. 20 families of one clan might share a single house. And here is a truth we forget in our age of solitary apartments. Bodies make heat. Many bodies make many heats. A longhouse crowded with kin was warmed not primarily by its hearths, but by the humans themselves. Community was the furnace. Along the center ran a corridor of small fires, each shared between two families, one on either side. And on the outside, come autumn, they piled the base of the house with earth and turf, so that the killing winds could not knock at the walls. Bunks lined the interior, 2 levels deep. Below, people slept. Above, dried corn and squash and beans were stored, and in their stored abundance those supplies became yet another insulating wall. Further north, the Algonquin peoples built wigwams, small domed structures of bent saplings, wrapped in bark and reed mats and hides. Once again, an air layer between coverings. Once again, snow banked around the base. Once again, a hearth so modest it would look absurd to a modern camper. And once again, it worked. Different peoples, different forests, different materials, the same underlying wisdom. Keep the heat, share the warmth, trust the design. But even the best designed house cannot burn wood all night. So what did they do when the fire finally sank into embers and the long, dark hours began? The answer is so simple it feels almost like magic. Stones. In the evening, while the small hearth still burned, several large stones were pushed into the coals. Certain stones only. Ones the elders knew would not shatter. As the family ate, as the children listened to stories, those stones drank the fire. When they glowed a deep red, wooden tongs lifted them out, and then, one by one, they were placed around the dwelling, under sleeping platforms, near the elders. Near the youngest child, they did not smoke, they did not need tending, they did not eat fuel. They simply sat there and gave back, slowly, for hours, the warmth they had swallowed. A hot stone under a bed of hides turned that bed into what we would today call, and marvel at, a heated mattress. A smaller stone, wrapped in leather, became a personal hand warmer, tucked against the chest of an old woman as she slept. A living, glowing, Stone Age battery. The same principle cooked their food. A pit, lined with hot stones, packed with meat and wild vegetables, sealed with hides and earth. Hours later, the family opened it to find tender, steaming food, cooked without a single flame having burned during the day. They used the fire twice, once for its light, once, stored in stone, for its long, slow gift. This was efficiency of the kind our disposable civilization can barely imagine. And then there was the other furnace, the one inside the human body itself. Nobody survives 40 below on tea and lettuce. The winter diet was dense, fatty, calorie-crowded. It had to be. Pemmican, again, was the masterpiece. Lean meat, dried until it snapped like glass, then pounded into powder, then bound together with rendered fat, half and half by weight, sometimes sweetened with wild berries, pressed into rawhide packets called parfleche. It kept for months, sometimes years. A single fist of pemmican could carry a hunter through a full day of tracking in a blizzard. It is, and I say this with a straight face, one of the most nutritionally perfect foods ever invented by any human culture. Explorers into the Arctic in the 1800s carried it. Modern endurance athletes still recreate it. Alongside pemmican came smoked meat, dried fish for peoples near rivers, roots and nuts stored in underground caches. Winter was not a season of starvation. Winter, for a well-prepared band, was a season of quiet, careful eating from the summer's abundance. The body, fed like this, became its own furnace. And the tipi, the clothing, the hot stones, all they had to do was refuse to let that internal fire escape. Now step back. Look at the whole system. The house that keeps heat, the clothing that keeps heat, the stones that store heat, the food that makes heat. It is one system, one design, one idea, expressed in many voices. But before any of it could work, one decision had to be made right. And that decision was made months before the first snow. Winter began, quietly, in July. The choice of a winter campsite was perhaps the single most consequential decision a band made all year. Get it right, and the winter was long but bearable. Get it wrong, and no amount of pemmican would save you. Never in the open. Always in the shelter of a river valley, a wooded ravine, a fold of the hills where the wind lost its teeth. Always near flowing water, fast enough not to freeze solid. Always facing south, so that the low, thin winter sun could pour whatever gold it had into the front of the teepees. If a grove of cottonwood or willow grew there, better still, a few trees meant a slow reserve of firewood for the deepest, cruelest nights. The teepees were pitched closer together in winter than in summer, not for gossip, for windbreak. The outer dwellings shielded the inner ones. It was a village breathing as one body, and life itself slowed. Warfare paused. Long journeys stopped. The men repaired bows, arrows, saddles. The women worked hides, sewed, cooked, taught. Days were quiet. Nights were long. And around every fire, the elders told the stories that no book had ever written down, because their true survival tool, the one nobody could copy just by studying their houses, was something else entirely. It was knowledge. An adult of the plains could name, without pausing, which wood burned longest, which burned hottest, which burned with the least smoke. They could read the shape of a cloud and know if a blizzard was 3 hours away or 3 days. They could feel a storm coming in the ache of a knee, in the behavior of a horse, in the direction dogs curled to sleep. None of this was written down. All of it was spoken, story to story, elder to child, through the long winter nights. And this is where the deepest secret finally reveals itself. Because they did not see winter as an enemy to be defeated. They did not curse it. They did not wage war on it. They saw winter as a season with its own laws, its own rhythms, its own strange gifts. And they adapted. They shared meat, so that no family in the camp went hungry. They cared for the elderly as a sacred duty, because the elderly carried the memory. They taught children to bear discomfort without complaint, not out of cruelty, but out of love, because they knew what winter would ask of those children one day. They laughed. Even in the deepest cold, they laughed. Because a people who cannot laugh at winter will be broken by it. The true fire that kept them alive was not the one in the hearth. It was the one between people. Kinship, story, ritual, trust. That fire never went out, no matter how cold the wind grew. So here is the truth, whole and clean. The peoples of North America did not survive their winters through brute strength or dumb luck. They survived through intelligence, through design, through humility before a world larger than themselves, through a system so complete that every part, from the tilt of a tipi pole to the weight of a stone under a sleeping child, spoke to every other part. They built a civilization on the idea that heat is not made, it is kept, that waste is not wealth, that community warms what walls cannot, that the mind is the oldest and most durable tool a human being will ever own. We live now in glass towers, poorly insulated, wasteful of energy, quietly fragile. If the grid failed for a week in January, most of our cities would collapse. Theirs would not have noticed. Perhaps their real gift to us is not a technique, not a recipe, not a design. Perhaps it is a question. What if the wisest civilizations were never the loudest? What if the ones who whispered and watched and listened to the wind understood more than we ever have? The fire is small. The fire has always been small. And that, in the end, is the whole secret. If this story moved something in you, stay with us. There is more to remember. There is more still to learn.